Oh. I love how many of you guys know this theme song.
Right off the bat.
So, what would you say if you could talk directly to your audience for 30 minutes uninterrupted? What kind of stories would you tell if you knew that you had a captive audience? We're going to discuss all this and more on today's episode of Your Unit Needs a Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Hatcher. Thank you all for coming. So I want to start today by telling you guys a little bit of a story. In 2007, one of my best friends went to prison on a 10-year sentence. Now, what he did to get that sentence is a different story for a different day. But what's important to our story today is that two things happened. One, I wrote him a lot of letters while he was down. And two, from 2008 to 2009, I deployed to Iraq. And what Jeremy and I discovered was that being an incarcerated male in a prison in Florida was very similar to being a soldier deployed to a military base in the Middle East. For example, we were both surrounded by walls topped with barbed wire and men with guns, right? We both ate at a dining facility, 3 meals a day, didn't really have a lot of other options. Strangely, neither of us was allowed to grow a beard. What else? Mail call was the most important time of the day. We were all looking forward to that, right? And when Jeremy had a medical issue, he was sent to a different facility in Lake Butler, Florida, which was a medical correctional facility. When I had a medical issue, I was sent to Longstrel. So it's really funny. We kind of had a laugh about how similar our lives were. So fast forward to 2017. Jeremy was released from prison in January. He's doing great now, in case you guys are wondering. But I heard about a new podcast called Ear Hustle, which I've written on the board over here. Ear Hustle, has anyone heard of it? Yeah. What's unique about Ear Hustle?
Ear Hustle is recorded from inside of a correctional facility.
Yeah, it's from San Quentin Prison in California. And it's made by inmates to kind of share their world with the rest of us who've never been to prison. And since I knew Jeremy and I knew his experiences with prison in Florida, I decided I'd give it a listen and see what it was like. And it's a really fantastic podcast. They do a really great job with storytelling. Now, at the time that I started listening to this podcast, I was teaching IPC, the Intermediate Photojournalist course, with a strong focus on storytelling. And I started telling my students, you need to listen to the Ear Hustle podcast for ideas about stories that you can tell in your military units. For example, the first episode is called Cellies. It's about cellmates, right? What do we all have in the military? Roommates, right? Battle buddies, shipmates. We all live in small confined areas. The people in San Quentin live in small confined areas. So they did a really good job of digging deep for these human interest stories that reminded me a lot of the same human interest stories I could see in military units. So I was telling my students, listen to this podcast, get these ideas for stories and write them. But never once did it cross my mind that any of my students should attempt a podcast. It just didn't even occur to me, right? Until last year. In August 2018, a good friend of mine, a different good friend, Hannah, sent me an email. Now, Hannah is an amazing scholar, and she had just spent the last year in Iceland on a Fulbright scholarship, a Fulbright fellowship. And while she was there, she created a podcast called Museums in Strange Places. And she went around to all the different museums in Iceland, and each episode she would talk about one. Her podcast ended up winning some awards, got a lot of notice, and people started reaching out to her to ask how they could create a podcast for their cultural organization or museum. So she wrote a book, Your Museum Needs a Podcast. Does that sound familiar? You can just change this word. I definitely ripped it off. But Hannah was writing me to ask me if I would read her book and provide a review for her. And I said, sure, yeah, for a friend, whatever, I'll do it. I had no interest in reading this book, you guys. I don't work for a museum, and I never thought I wanted to start a podcast. But as I was reading it, all these pieces started to click into place. And I thought, oh my God, military units need to have podcasts. We have the stories that are already being told about other organizations. Why aren't we telling them through this medium? We're missing out. So I told Katie I want to do this seminar. It's taken a few months, but here we are today. Your unit needs a podcast. And I just want to say thank you all for coming. So I think everyone's here because you generally already have a love or at least an appreciation for podcasts, right? But just in case any of us here are uninitiated, what the heck is a podcast anyway? A podcast is digital audio file available for download on the internet, and they're usually produced in a series. I like to think of podcasts as like the old-timey radio shows, right? stories told in chapters. But instead of having to, settle around the old family radio set every night for the latest installment of The Lone Ranger or Little Orphan Annie, you can watch or listen to a podcast anywhere you are, anywhere in the world. Oops, that didn't go there. Junior Apple team. You can listen to it while you're riding in your car. You can listen to it while you're doing the dishes at home, mowing your lawn, on your workout. And the mobility of podcasts is part of what's made them so ubiquitous, so popular. So does anyone here know how old podcasts are? When did podcasts start? What do you think?
10 years ago?
10 years ago? So 2009?
I feel like I remember hearing the word when I was working at the San Francisco Chronicle, and that would have been 2005.
Okay, 2005.
2001.
When did the first
iPods came out?
2000.
So I was surprised to learn that some element of podcasting has been around since the late 80s. Since the beginning of the internet, people have been putting audio files online for other people to listen to. They used to call it audio blogging. But the term podcast and the current format, like the RSS feeds, was actually created in 2004. 2004 is also when podcasting got its name. A British journalist, Ben Hammersley, writing for The Guardian, was writing about this new technology, and he didn't know what to call it. So he smashed together two words into a portmanteau. What is that? Anyone know? An iPod and broadcasting. And he came up with podcast. And I'll tell you what, a few months after he published that article, the Oxford English Dictionary contacted him, and they made it podcast their word of the year, 2005. Pretty cool, right? So there was a lot of buzz in 2004 and 2005, a lot of excitement about this new technology and the potential for where it could go. But for some reason, it just never took off. Podcasting kind of stalled out. It still existed, but it wasn't very popular until something big happened in 2014. Anyone know what it was? Serial. The producers of This American Life from NPR released Serial, which was a season-long, long-form journalism story looking into the investigation of this murder that resulted in this high school student being sent to jail. So it was a cultural phenomenon. The first season has been downloaded 80 million times, broke every record there ever was for a podcast, and it still holds the records for the most listened to podcast. Did any of you guys listen to Serial? Yeah, me too. So Serial was actually my podcast zero. This is my first podcast that I ever listened to, and I actually have Katie Walsh to thank for that. I came into work one morning, I think it was like a Monday, right? And she was talking to one of our coworkers about this podcast that they both listened to on the way to work. And they were talking about it and who they thought did it. And I was like, man, I gotta get in on this. So I started listening to podcasts. I started listening to Serial. Today, I just counted on my phone, I'm subscribed to 40 different podcasts. So I guess you could say I'm a fan. So of those people who are listening to podcasts, who else is interested? Are you guys part of that podcast demographic? Does anyone here not listen to podcasts? All right, sir. Let's take a look at people who are. 51% of the US population, that's 144 million people, have listened to at least one podcast. More than, or half of every household in the United States is a podcast listening home. 49% of podcast listening is done at those homes, and 22% is done in the car. Podcast listeners are loyal. 32% of the population, or about 90 million people, listen to podcasts monthly, and 22% of the population, or 62 million, listen to podcasts weekly. 16 million people self-identify as avid listeners, and I'm definitely one of those. Podcast listeners are also pretty affluent. About 45% of podcast listeners have an annual household income of more than $75,000 a year. Now that's about compared to 35% of the US population. And then last but not least, they're also educated. 27% of podcast listeners have at least a 4-year degree, compared to only 19% of the United States. And this is the part that gets people really excited about podcasters, is that the majority of podcasters, the overwhelming majority of podcasters, will listen to all or most of every episode that they put on. And that's unprecedented among other media. The majority of podcasters are men, which probably explains why comedy is the #1 podcast genre, followed closely by education and then news.
So that's the number of podcasters or podcast listeners?
This is the number of podcast listeners.
Podcast
Yep,
listeners.
that's gone up over the years. And you can see how quickly It's growing. And they expect those numbers to keep going up. So while 51% of Americans have listened to podcasts, 70% are familiar with the term, which means that hopefully those people will start getting interested and listen. So I'm getting all these statistics, by the way, from a company called Podcast Insights, and they update it every year, all the listenership information, how many podcasts there are, how many people are listening, and what those demographics look like. So you might be thinking, okay, Stephanie, this is cool, good information. What does it have to do with me? Why does my unit need a podcast? Well, it's simple. Your unit is a podcast because you exist. And by you, I mean military communicators, right? Your services thought that it was important enough to tell your military stories, to have a specific job set aside just for military communicators. What is your job as a military communicator? What's your goal?
Tell stories.
Yeah, to tell military stories, right? So with statistics like podcasting has, it would be a huge missed opportunity if you weren't at least considering tapping into that and creating a podcast for your unit. So how do we get started creating a podcast? Well, the first step is to come up with an idea. And I gotta tell you something, guys, it has to be a really, really good idea. There are more than 750,000 podcasts published today. That is 750,000. So in order to make your podcast worthwhile, to make it stand out, you need to give people something that they're not already getting somewhere else. So step one, come up with an idea and then do some research. Make sure nobody else is already doing your idea. The good news is that most military-related podcasts that exist today are produced and run by veterans. So there are very few active duty podcasts that are currently on the market. I know Lieutenant Commander Rasnick was telling me they had one at his last unit, correct? Yeah. So you guys, the market's kind of wide open and ready for you to step in there. You want to pick a topic that's both entertaining and informative, because while you may get an initial interest for all those people who are seeing your podcast as something new, you're not going to keep them unless you can deliver really strong, solid content. So as a group, I would like us to come up with a podcast idea for DINFOS. Yeah, Master Individual, what do you got?
I've already thought of this one for a while.
I love it.
Because of Everything is Alive.
Uh-huh.
So the idea behind Everything is Alive is, like I said, they take inanimate objects, they have an actor portray the voice of that inanimate object. So following that same suit with inanimate objects that represent DINFOS, like microphones in radio.
Okay.
Having the voice of the microphone. How many initial entry students have gone through and voiced their concerns, they've put their voice into that microphone.
All right.
Things like the seal, having someone voice the seal, and how many commandants it's seen walk through its door, how many promotion ceremonies, graduations it's seen.
Hall of Heroes.
Hall of
Yeah.
Heroes
Oh, Hall of
itself,
Heroes,
I think,
yeah. Yep.
So,
All right. What else? Who else has an idea for a podcast for DINFOS? Shelby.
I've had this idea that I've been rolling around for a while that I can never seem to like articulate the right way, but I really like social media takeovers.
Mm-hmm.
So I like when a smaller subset of the organization runs the page for the day. The
Okay.
extent that they actually run the page obviously can be decided beforehand,
Okay.
but I like the idea of like putting some storytelling ability in the hands of those smaller units, whether it's departments or specific classes,
Mm-hmm.
and getting those people to talk about
Like
their
a
stuff
day in the life.
and tell their story. Exactly, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Any other ideas for a DINFOS specific podcast?
I wouldn't mind an actual kind of like wandering man on the street
Okay.
format. I mean, like literally accosting people at lunch.
Mm-hmm.
Just, and it could be anybody. It could be a student, it could be a teacher. It's like you don't even know. Almost like you walk into the room, close your eyes, spin around and point at somebody, and then walk over and try to strike up a conversation.
And what are you talking to them about?
About their journey in DINFOS.
Okay. All right. What else? Mr. Bell?
I could think like everybody here, the people that come from experience and have been out in the field can come in and tell the story behind the story. Like,
Oh, yeah.
the journey to getting to the story, especially, unique conditions, different types of deployments, like, sometimes just getting to your subject and getting it set up and is a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Any others? Any other ideas? Yeah. That's what I currently have.
Yeah, it would be some sort of tactic Tactics and Techniques podcast. So
Okay.
we've got a lot of talented people here across all spectrums of communication, so talking to those individuals who are particularly skilled at certain tasks and giving a how-to podcast. Essentially, that would provide a lot of value to listeners.
Great. All right, so Ms. Walsh, since you are the FTDO guru, which of these podcasts would you like us to develop for the next 20 minutes?
Gosh, I kind of really like that story behind the story.
Okay.
Like how I built this, how I got this.
How I got this shot, how I got this, whatever. Okay, so story behind the story. Okay, so we're gonna keep that in mind as we move through this lecture. All right. So now that we have our topic, we have to identify our audience. So who's our audience for the Story Behind the Story podcast? Who are we talking to? Are we talking to students? Are we talking to instructors, former students, former instructors, military communicators worldwide? Who is our audience for this one?
I think it's mostly students, but a little bit of everybody.
Okay. So one thing you have to watch out for with a podcast is saying a little bit of everybody, because if you don't target your podcast towards one specific audience, you risk not attracting any audience, right? You make it too general. You really have to fill a niche with a podcast. So we gotta get really specific. So some questions we can ask ourselves to help us find our audience are here. How old is your audience, right? You're gonna speak to teenagers differently than you're gonna speak to young adults, differently than you're gonna speak to retirees, right? Where do they live? What keeps them up at night, right? What do they do for fun? What are they interested in? What do they know about your organization? What do they want to know about your organization? And what do they need to know about your organization? And what do they want to listen to? Now, how do you know what somebody wants to listen to? You can ask them. You can put out a poll, right? Would you be interested in seeing this, this, or this? You can also do your research. Once you identify who they are, where they live, what they're into, you can look at podcast stats and statistics and find out who's listening to what. So if your target audience is already listening to these top 3 podcasts, then maybe you should use one of those to kind of model the type of content that you're providing for them. Okay? So for our DINFOS audience, who's gonna be our target here?
Students?
Students?
Sure.
Yeah, I like students. Maybe students
Recent alum.
DINFOS alumni?
and recent alum. Yeah. Right? Because these are the guys that you can get excited about. You're gonna go out and do some cool stuff. Sometimes you're gonna have to get creative to get that shot or to get that story, right? So okay, so we're gonna say our target audience for this is students and recent alum. All right, now that we have our target audience, let's talk about the format. What is our podcast going to look like? There are 3 types of formats that we're gonna talk about today. Now, there are a ton of different types of formats for podcasts. The 3 that we're gonna talk about today, in the interest of time, are the 3 that are most popular and also 3 that I think best fit military content. And they are the interview/talk show, the solo scripted, and the narrative. So we're gonna take a look at each one. The interview talk show format is one of the most common. There are many different varieties, but it generally breaks down to 2 or more people talking to each other about a specific topic. Sorry, 1 second. This should generally be unscripted, although as the host, you do want to have your planned questions to kind of, and an outline maybe, to keep the podcast on track. Now this is one of the simplest, least intensive formats to use. You can literally just sit in a room with a microphone and talk about a topic. But what's difficult about this one is that sometimes as a host, it's difficult to get that engaging conversation going if you aren't skilled already in the interviewing process and how to lead somebody to the direction that you want them to go. And it's also unpredictable. Your guests may not say what you think or hope or want them to say, and you have to learn how to deal with that. But if you can get the hang of it, interview podcasts are great because they let your audiences hear from the source, right? They can hear from unique, interesting voices that they might not always have access to. Now, Mr. Robertson actually runs his own podcast called The Rebel Rundown, where it is an interview/talk show format, and they talk about Star Wars, different topics of Star Wars. So Pete, could you share with us some of your experiences? Like, what are the biggest struggles in doing this type of format podcast?
Sure. It actually started with, I have a podcast group called Pop Culture Uncovered, and we do about 6 to 8 podcasts a month on a variety of topics. And so each one is a little different. There's news from pop culture and entertainment. There's a deep dive into like a specific topic, and then I branched off because I'm a Star Wars nerd with the Rebel Rundown. first thing that we discovered was, you know, two people in the same room have a lot more depth to that conversation than what we were doing before, which was over Skype. And so one, having that like in-person setup, a nice quiet like room off to the side, to actually have those questions was the best thing. And it took me a long time because I had worked in broadcasting at 2 different AFN billets. But the people that I worked with were like, you know, we need to go in fresh. Like, we're really great when we're like off the cuff, and we're really, you know, fantastic. So anytime we would bring up a topic and start talking about it, our guy would say like, save it for the podcast, save it for the podcast. And what we discovered was that was the worst way to do business. And finally, once we fired him, we started. It was unscripted, but at the same time, we had those conversations and just sort of like, okay, we'll talk about that, and knowing what somebody's gonna kind of say, we're always gonna say it differently. You could run through it 20 times, and then when it's time to record, it still will come out fresh. It will still be, you know, a little unclean and a little natural and perfect for that. And so planning was the most important thing. Planning, having people in the same room, having people, at least one person who can steer. For the longest time, we had 4 people on a podcast, and everyone deferred to everybody. Everyone had to make a point. And then what we learned was, you know, 2 to 3 people is great. People who know how to listen to each other, and one person, no matter who it is, one person sort of steering that conversation. Even if it's not obvious to the listener, it should be obvious to the people in the room.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, those were the biggest things, that to have, you know, a group podcast with multiple voices, it just made the most sense, and we got a lot better at it. It's been 5 years since we started that podcast, and now we're actually seeing our numbers start to move.
And how about choosing guests? You made sure that you have people who have different opinions, right? To have a really
like,
more live. If everyone agreed on it, it'd be a really short podcast. You'd be like, oh yeah, this is great. Yeah, no, it's great. I loved it too. Crickets, right? So you gotta have some kind of discussion or conversation. So even if it's just somebody playing devil's advocate, you want to have that good conversation. So one of my favorite interview podcasts is Ecologies, and this is the humorist Ali Ward. Has anyone heard this one before? So every week she talks to a new ologist, right? And it runs the gamut from literally A to Z, from aerologists, which are people who study Mars, to, and I have to read this one, zymologists. Anyone want to guess what a zymologist studies? Beer, which is a surprise to me, yeah. So I'm going to play a little snippet of an interview in honor of Shark Week. If you guys don't know Shark Week, she interviews a slakomorphologist, which is a shark doctor or scientist. It's not working. It's my fault. It's volume. Hold on.
Dr. Chris Lowe, right now, single-handedly making sharks lovable and math cool. He is a thought magician.
I just get so excited, even about math.
What?
Well, because there's math in sharks.
Ooh, like what?
They're covered in math. Their teeth, you know, they're a math problem, right? Because they have never-ending rows of teeth, and the teeth keep falling out. And of course, how do sharks live? Well, we don't know. But now we're coming up with new techniques to figure out how long sharks live, like sleeper sharks, like Greenland sharks that have been aged to 470 years old.
How do they find out that that's how old they are?
Really cool. From the dead ones, you can take their eye lens, and then you can run a laser through that, and you can measure when radioactive carbon was in the atmosphere from when we did bomb tests back in the 50s.
Oh my god.
So it becomes a little chronometer, a little timekeeper, and then you can count these bands, the amount of carbon, radioactive carbon to non-radioactive carbon, and use that as a chronometer to go back.
Oh my god.
So 470 years old, that's the oldest vertebrate on the planet.
So what Ali Ward does is she has a conversation with people. She asks them questions, but she also gives feedback. She has natural responses. So it doesn't feel like you're sitting in like, and just listening to somebody read some questions and somebody else answer. They're having a conversation, which gives you a little bit more intimate feel as a listener, like you're part of that conversation or that you're there in the room with them. And listeners respond to that a little bit more. So one thing that I liked about Ecologies, when I listened to this podcast, I thought, we could do that in the military. We could interview different MOSs every time, right? How many different MOSs do you think you have on one base? Or on a ship?
1 million.
Feels like it, right?
Pretty close.
Yeah,
Probably like 80.
yeah, a lot of different jobs, right? The average
Somewhere in the neighborhood.
podcast season is about 13 episodes. So if you've got 80 people, you've got a couple years worth of, or a couple seasons worth of stuff here to go off of, right? And I think that we forget, because we're around the military all day, that most of America has never served in the military, and most of them don't know somebody who has. So they have no idea what life is like in the military. Podcasts are a great way for us to show them that, right? And so we kind of overlook the stuff that we are so used to, we take for granted. But if you listen to these podcasts, kind of think, how can I turn that into a military podcast? All right, so our next format is the solo scripted. It's really exactly like it sounds. It's one host reading a script, right? The entire episode is scripted. Now, the benefit of a solo scripted episode is that you don't have to worry about your guest, right? You don't have to worry about what other people are going to say. You are responsible for the entire content. Everything that gets said is planned, right? There's no whoopsies, gotchas, mistakes. That said, everything rests on you now. One host has to carry the entire show for an entire season or multiple seasons, right? That can be a big burden for anyone. You also have to worry about, some shows do just solo scripted the entire way, like Lore, which we're going to hear in a second. But a lot of shows that have multiple hosts will often throw in a solo scripted just to break things up. Maybe somebody went on vacation, or they just want to kind of make it a little bit different, add something different. So one of my favorite solo scripted podcasts is Lore, where the host, Aaron Mahnke, he explores stories, creatures, all the the little events that make up our traditional folklore and also urban legends, and he kind of gives them a little bit of a scary little tone. So here's a clip from episode 14, which is called The Others.
From the ancient hills of Iceland and Brazil to the blacktop streets of urban America, our fascination with the others has been a constant, unrelenting obsession. But while most stories only make us smile at the pure fantasy of it all, there are some that defy dismissal. They leave us with more questions than answers. And they force us to come to grips with a frightening truth. If we're not alone in this world, then we're also not safe.
So you guys heard the difference between a solo scripted and an interview podcast, right? The last one that we're going to talk about is the narrative, and this is my personal favorite. So the narrative podcast is different from the first two in that the narrative podcast generally tells one story over the course of an entire season. And now each episode, instead of being its own story, is just a chapter of the one big story. This is where you get that long-form, deep dive journalism, where they can really get deep into a story, they talk to all the different minor characters, and they bring it to life with a mix of audio. They're going to have their scripted narration, they're going to have their interviews, they're going to have their ambient and nature sounds. They're going to have music to set the tone and add ambience. They might even have like old news clips, like if it's a crime podcast, they might have clips of the news stories that went out or at the time that it happened. Old audio, whatever they can find, they're going to throw it in there to create this world for you, the listener, to follow episode to episode. So the most popular is obviously Serial, but some other good ones since its success have been like S-Town, Dirty John, and Missing Richard Simmons. So we're going to listen to a little bit of Dirty John, because it's one of my favorite true crime podcasts. My hairdresser actually told me about this in 2017 when it first came out, and I decided to listen to the first episode while I was taking a walk one day, and I was hooked. I binged the rest of the episode. So I'm going to play you guys the first 90 seconds of the very first episode, and see if it doesn't hook you too and make you guys want to listen to it.
There are a total of 13 stab wounds which have penetrated the body. They are all arbitrarily numbered from 1 to 13. There are 8 wounds noted in the left side and upper back, the shoulder and scapular area, where wound number 1 is on the top of the left shoulder.
I'm sitting in the office of a man who prosecutes murders for a living. His name is Matt Murphy. He's a veteran assistant district attorney who handles homicides out of Newport Beach, California. If you're from somewhere else and have a mental picture of Orange County about an hour south of LA, Newport Beach is probably part of that image. It's the side of the county that the tourist guides want you to see. Pacific Coast Highway runs through it, luxury shopping, piers and surf shops and plastic surgeons, yachts and cliffside mansions. I used to cover the city as a crime reporter for a local newspaper. There weren't a lot of murders, maybe 1 a year, 2 2 or 3 in a very bad year. Greed or lust figured prominently in the most memorable ones. These days, if you're one of the rare people who meet a violent death in Newport Beach, Matt Murphy is the prosecutor who will hear about it. The homicide case that landed on his desk in the summer of 2016 was particularly violent, and it was unique in his experience.
Number 5 is on the left, more to the upper right.
So I love that one because he sounds just like you would expect like a seedy private eye and some film noir to sound, right? He was kind of got that voice, and he's got the music, and so you hear we've got that scripted narration to start us off and set the scene. We've got that audio of the medical examiner reading the medical report, right? And then we got the kind of creepy, like, ominous music to set us up for a really cool story. And it is. You guys, I definitely recommend checking this out if you haven't already. All right, so now that we've learned about the 3 formats that are best suited to military podcasts, which one do you think we'll use for our story behind the story? For our DINFOS podcast, which one are we going to use?
The first one, the shark one.
Yeah, the interview, right? Because we're going to be talking to different people. So the interview talk show method or format. Cool. Too easy, right? So now we know our format. We've got an idea for a killer topic. We know how we're going to go forward. There are still a few more things that we have to consider before we get going. And they are, how long is each episode going to be? Are we aiming for like 30-minute podcasts? Are we looking for an hour? What do we want to do with this? How often are we going to release these podcasts? Weekly, monthly, bi-weekly? Are you going to do one season or are you going to do multiple seasons? If you're only going to do one season, is it going to be one story over the entire season, or are we going to break it up and tell different stories each episode? Who's going to host it? Who's going to produce it? How much is it going to cost, right? All these are things that you have to take into consideration. I think a lot of us come up with really strong, good ideas, but then you have to do the work and put it all together. So before you do anything else, you should be able to answer this question, or this statement. Our podcast will have blank episodes every month, year, for blank months and years. Now, it's perfectly fine to lowball this on your first go around. You don't really know how much effort is going to be involved in creating a podcast if you've never done it before, right? And even if you have done a podcast before, you haven't done this specific podcast before. So you don't know how much time it's going to take, how much effort, right? You don't know how it's going to be received. So for our DINFOS podcast, let's just say we're going to do 2 episodes every month for 3 months. So we're committing to 6 episodes, and if it turns out really well and everyone likes it, then maybe we'll go for a second season, and we'll do it a little bit more often, a little bit longer. We can readjust once we get the hang of it. Okay? All right, so now we're ready for step 3. Pick a catchy name. This is the fun part, right? I often think about names sometimes before I even have my idea really fleshed out for my podcast, because they're fun. But when choosing your name, you want to make sure it's short, original, memorable, and easy to pronounce, because we want people to talk about it, right? The majority of podcasts are discovered through word of mouth. So you want people to talk about your podcast. And your name should fit the topic. So for example, if we're doing a story about the story behind the story, and if we called this podcast DINFOS Rocks, that would be a little bit, it doesn't quite match, right? Because it's not about DINFOS. It's about the people at DINFOS doing different things. So let's try and think of a cool name for this podcast. What do you guys think?
I think story behind the story is already a pretty good name.
It is a pretty solid name, absolutely. What do you guys think? The rest, anyone else? Any other ideas? All right, story behind the story it is. Yeah,
Best story ever told.
Best story ever told.
Story behind the storyteller.
Story behind the storyteller. Ooh, I kind of like that one too. I don't know, what do you guys think? Miss Walsh, you'll be our final arbiter. What do you say?
Oh, jeez. Actually, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Story behind the story.
All right, so the story behind the story, it is. All right, so now we have our podcast fully fleshed out. We have a name, we have our format, we know what it's going to be about, we know who our audience is. Now comes the fun part. You get to pitch your podcast. Now, before you can start any podcast, as military practitioners, who's going to have to give you the green light? Your command, right? Yeah. So how do we pitch it to our command? Well, first you want to write a proposal. And your proposal should have all the following information. The idea for the podcast, your topic, your name, how long it's going to run, right? Your target audience, and your goals. What are your goals with this podcast? What strategic mission are you trying to advance? It could just be, we want to familiarize people with the military. We want to humanize troops. We want to gather support. Whatever it is, reach out to the community. You need to put that in your proposal. You gotta tell your commander why this is a good idea, right? Give them those podcast listener statistics to show them how important it is to get on this podcast bandwagon. You also want to tell who's going to be involved in creating each episode, and then you have to include a budget. How much is this going to cost the unit in both money and time, right? If you guys need to buy any equipment, this is a place to put it in there. Chances are, though, most of you are going to have the equipment that you need because you're a military communications shop. So that's a great place to say, hey, this isn't going to cost us anything. And that's a really big, as a commander, they like to hear that. Free, right? Free doesn't hurt. So hopefully your command's going to approve your podcast idea. And if that happens, you get to step 5, start recording. Now, we don't unfortunately have time today to get into how to record a podcast, to talk about what kinds of stories to tell, how to gather the audio. If you guys are interested, I'll do a part 2 where we do a deep dive into gathering content and creating stories. But for now, hopefully you guys will all agree that your unit needs a podcast. And before we close, I want to share with you guys a list of ideas that I just came up with. I literally took 10 minutes and I sat down and I brainstormed and came up with a bunch of ideas for potential military podcasts. And before we start, I want you guys to come up with a couple too. So what are some ideas that you guys have for military podcasts? Yes? Sir.
We talked about like using one for like tactics and techniques.
Yep.
Probably a podcast that reflects on when those tactics and techniques that don't go right. So
Okay.
something like, what were we thinking?
Okay, what were we thinking?
Yeah.
That's a funny one.
And just talk to the practitioners behind it, talk and just see what their method was. That it might have had good intentions, but it was just maybe it just been a bad.
Yeah, so we can learn from others' mistakes, right? This would be a great podcasting series for you in the Army for the Center for Army Lessons Learned, right? There's an actual whole cell in the Army where they just do all the things that we did wrong, and let's learn from them. So if I were to fall, for example, I would do that podcast in a heartbeat. Yeah. All right, what else? Yeah.
I don't know how this would be accomplished, but I think it'd be pretty entertaining to have like a almost talk show type interview thing with a bunch of Marines in the field. Because we talk about some really just random things. I just think it'd be pretty entertaining.
Okay, what would you call that, do you think? Like, you could have some kind of like radio chatter or some kind of like military term.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay. What else? Jay?
Something like ideas in motion, and the idea here is people who have ideas for process improvement or a new design of something.
Okay.
It'd be kind of like, I say Mythbusters, but not really. Basically, it's like, hey, I've got this idea for a new type of boot.
Almost like
Okay,
right?
let's actually beta test your prototype.
Yeah.
And it could be procedures, it could be it could be materials, it could be a lot of different things.
So the thing I want you guys to think about is your unit needs a podcast, right? So what unit would do this?
That's the tricky part.
Yeah. Because if your command's gonna let you spend the money on it, it's gotta have something to do with your unit's goals, right? So you really wanna, when you're thinking about these, try to think like, what could I do at my unit? So here's some of the ideas that I had, and feel free to steal these guys. I hope you guys all leave here and start creating a podcast. But we got a traveling or cultural podcast when stationed overseas, or Navy ports of call, right? If I'm a new troop and I'm going overseas and there's a podcast all about things I can do around Wiesbaden, Germany, I'm probably gonna listen to that, right? Or if I'm going on my first deployment and I know we're stopping at Bahrain, we're stopping in the Philippines, I'd listen to a podcast that talks about all the things I could do there, right? Innovative military scientific / medical discoveries. There's a huge history of medical and scientific discoveries that we take for granted in our everyday civilian life that most people don't know were actually spearheaded in the military. Spy stories. I actually taught a class that had some folks from the NSA, and they just kind of sat back and were like, man, I don't know why I'm here. We can't publish any of this stuff, right? Tell the stuff that's not classified, right? Tell me the stories about the spies that you've caught. You know, give me the information that you can. Those would be thrilling. I would listen to that. Another one could be greatest battles of your unit. And actually, Shane used to work for the Discovery Channel, and they have a television program called Against the Odds that was battles where the U.S. military was outnumbered, and they ended up winning. And he turned that into a podcast for the Discovery Channel. So that's pretty cool. Life on a military base or a ship is kind of day in the life. That would be like your hustle. Explore the different MOSs in your units, like Ecologies. You can do historical profiles, Medal of Honor winners to come from your Game of Thrones? Okay, the Battle of Knights, or the Battle of the Night, or whatever it's called, like the second to last one. It was horrible. The tactics and techniques were just out of this world bad. And so a lot of my friends and I had a fun time dissecting that from a military standpoint. So watch a movie. Watch a movie and talk about it. And talk about how good or how bad they did at depicting them. And again, Discovery had a TV show called An Officer in a Movie, where they would sit down with a military officer, show a movie, and talk about the historical events around it, and what really happened. All right, barracks lawyer. This could be a fun one. Have a JAG officer answer questions from people who have issues, or have heard something. Oh, I heard they're going to do this, or yeah, if you can do this, you can get, you can claim a dependent or whatever. So just have a barracks lawyer or have an actual lawyer answer those questions. Oh, you can have a question and answer. Go on Quora, go on Reddit. A lot of people have questions about the military, so pull some of those and just answer listener questions and say, what do you want to know about the military? Here's an episode on it. You could do an advice podcast. There's one called Dear Sugars that you could model this off of, where troops could write in anonymously asking for advice. It can be kind of lonely out there, right, on a boat or on the middle of the desert. And then you could do a storytelling podcast. Has anyone ever listened to The Moth, right, or Mortified? They usually give a theme, and then people submit stories that relate to that theme, and if they're selected, then they stand up in front of an audience and they tell their story. So you guys could do something like that. And this one's kind of my favorite. Where's the beef? This is a new podcast by John Hodgman, who's a comedian, and it's called Judge John Hodgman. And people call in who have a beef, and they both get to say their side, and he settles the dispute and tells who's the winner. So in my version of this, I think it'd be hilarious if it was a cook who gets to settle it. Yeah. So the point is, guys, this took me like 10 minutes to just come up with these ideas. Some of them are contenders, and some of them are just ridiculous, right? But one of the quickest ways that I found some of these was I scrolled through the podcasts that I listened to, and I said, how can I take this format and apply it to military life? So I hope you guys will all do the same. I will send you these slides if you're interested. This is the resource page. It has links to all the podcasts that I mentioned, plus a link to this book, Your Museum Needs Podcast, and some of the other things that I mentioned. So, yes.
So, DINFOS actually is able to host podcasts.
I didn't know that. That's wonderful.
Yeah, my last base, we took our video series that we were doing, it was called One, where we went out and every single month we would call one of our squadrons within one of our units, and we would find somebody to be able to tell their story. What specifically, what their job was,
Yeah.
but how they did it, why they did it, and we would feature them. And when we found out that DINFOS was hosting,
That's really cool.
we were like, oh, well, we need to jump on this, and so we created our one series as a podcast.
I love that idea, actually. And that reminds me, there was
And it's free, so
Yeah.
I mean,
There was a TV show years and years ago, and it was called something like Everyone Has a Story, and they would literally like throw a dart on a map, they'd go to that town, they'd find a phone booth, so this is how you know how old it is, and they'd get the phone book, and they'd flip through it and stop at a page, and they would call that person. And the first person that picked up, they would say, we'd like to come to your house and do a story. And people would be like, oh, no, there's nothing interesting about me. And they're like, there's always something interesting. And they would go, and you would get these most amazing, beautiful human interest stories completely randomly. So you guys could absolutely do that on a base or in your unit, right?
absolutely.
I love that idea.
There's amazing stories out there. We told a story of a young staff sergeant who was homeless, had a child, she was a single mother, trying to figure out her way in life,
Yeah.
and the Air Force led her into, finding her life. She actually has a master's degree
Wow.
now, and she was running a $13.6 million medical treatment facility.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Those are the stories. And those are the stories you don't really hear, right? Because what do we all know about news? If it bleeds, it leads, right? People are more interested in what we're doing wrong. They're more interested in the fighting, the war, whatever. If you could show that human interest side and get people interested, that could go a long way towards telling the stories that you want to tell. And with the podcast, you have complete control over that. You don't have to wait for an outside agency to pick it up because you're publishing it yourself. So make it interesting, make it entertaining, and get it out there. And hopefully, we'll talk in the next one about how to market it so you can pick up some listeners. But I really hope that you guys after today will seriously consider trying to start a podcast at your unit. And I know most of your unit here is DINFOS, so maybe not right now, but maybe start developing it for your next unit, or reach back to the unit that you were at if you have a really great idea. So, cool. All right, guys, well, that concludes our seminar. Thank you all so much for showing up today. there if you guys are interested. I printed out 2 sheets. There's a podcast pitch worksheet and also a proposal. So if you guys want to grab those, take them back with you. You could potentially use those.
And if anybody has not gotten their contact information, just please sign in before you.
And then I also recommend if you're looking for a new podcast, just snap a shot of this board. A lot of great ideas over here.
Did you take a picture of it?
Not yet.